The lantern light skims the edge of the cliff where the town's square bleeds into the dark sea. Salt stings my eyes, and the wind tugs at the edges of everyone's coats, as if the night itself wants to pull secrets from us. I am Detective Iris Calder, weathered enough to know when truth arrives in whispers, and when it crashes in like a wave you didn't see coming. Tonight, the village will vote on a killer, and the tide decides nothing. The tide merely listens while we pretend there is a simple answer. The beloved schoolteacher, Leela Hartley, lies somewhere between here and the sea, unloved by circumstance and mourned by almost everyone. The town's ritual is murky but simple. When a serious crime happens, we name a person and hand them to the authorities. A quiet vote, a sealed envelope, a quiet exit for the truth, all designed to keep the peace on this ragged coast. Detectives are asked not to intervene, to observe, to note every tremor of fear and pride in the crowd, and to pretend we're not listening to the old rules that tell us who is allowed to be afraid. Tonight the crowd gathers not with pomp, but with weathered nerves. The fishermen stand shoulder to shoulder with shopkeepers, with teachers and retirees who've known the sea longer than they've known themselves. The room smells like brine and old wood, dust motes floating in the lantern light like quiet moths. The tally sheet is passed from hand to hand, each name whispered as if the person might disappear if spoken aloud too loud. When the final name is read, the room exhales in unison, a kind of surrender to the idea that resolution has finally landed. They name Eli Turner, a quiet, elderly widower who never raised his voice except to tell a child a story about boats and the weather. The crowd murmurs, a soft, surprised wave of assent that sounds almost grateful. I take notes, which is hardly necessary because the room's truth sits on the air like a chalk outline. The widow, Thelma Rhodes, sits a few rows from the batch died last night, the same night as Leela Hartley, in a way that makes the town feel suddenly small and haunted. Thelma's vote, I am told later, wasn't counted because she's gone. The envelope she would have opened is now a memory. The last vote of a woman who spoke little but kept watch on the water all the same. A note is taped to Leela's desk in the schoolhouse. A quiet, right thing that says, in better handwriting than mine, that fear cannot be the only language we speak here. I tell myself it's enough to watch this play out, to see who carries the weight of the village's fear home with them. But something about the night turns under the lantern light in a way that makes the air taste metallic, as if a storm has swallowed a truth and swallowed it again. The townspeople go to their homes with steps that sound like the slow creak of a pier, each one carrying a secret for which they have already crafted an alibi. Dinosaurs those big, ancient tensions that refuse to delinger in every doorway. The old man who swore he saw nothing, the young mother who swore she saw too much, the fisherman who swore he saw the future in the waves and wasn't sure whether it was good or bad. The more I listen, the more I hear their excuses clink together like bottles in a storm. By morning, the evidence grows fainter and heavier at once. The diary of Thelma Rhodes surfaces from a back room of the widow's former home, tucked between the pages of a prayer book and a calendar that marks every blue moon with a reminder that the sea forgives nothing. The diary is a fragile thing, the pages smelling faintly of smoke and lavender, the ink a stubborn brown that has survived decades of damp and sentiment. I read in fragments, like dipping a hand into cold water and finding it already numb from the chill of another truth. The diary does not name a killer in so many words, but it does something sharper. It exposes a hidden connection between the two deaths, the teachers and the widows, both of which were treated as separate tragedies by a village that wants to keep two secrets in play at once. Thelma writes of a pact, a kind of covenant made long ago by people who believed the best way to protect themselves was to pretend danger lived somewhere else, in someone else's life. The pact was this: when a crime threatened the village's fragile order, you vote to identify a culprit. You hand one person over, and you swallow the fear that the rest of you will never admit to feeling. The guardrails of silence are strong on a coast where stories are currency, and shame travels light, slipping from one mouth to another until no one can tell where the lie ends and the truth begins. Leela Hartley had discovered something about minds and margins, and the way fear can curl a person into a protective pose. Thelma discovered something after Leela's last class. After that night, when the sea was loud enough to drown a whisper, perhaps even loud enough to hush a confession, the diary suggests they both knew that naming a killer would not actually set anyone free. It would only expose who among them would rather live with a lie than face what that truth would demand of them. The pact's old rules were being tested by two events that could not be reconciled by the old fear: a death not swallowed by the vote, and another death that was too easily blamed on a man who had never learned to argue with tide or truth. I walk the cliffs in the cold dawn, the sea dragging itself along the rocks like a patient medic, trying to coax a stubborn pain from a patient. The town's edges, their gardens and windows, all look the same as they did yesterday, except for the weight of the diary in my coat pocket, and the sense that the night had not ended, but merely shuffled its cards. Dinosaurs gnash their teeth inside me in a dozen small ways. What I believed about people, what I believed about guilt, what I believed about the possibility of a straightforward ending to a story this tangled. The town's ritual has a logic of its own, but the diary reveals a logic that predates the ritual and will outlast the logic of a pact that makes sure no one is entirely safe and no one is entirely innocent when a secret asks for a body to be laid down beside another secret. And then the 5-second moment arrives like a wave you can neither retreat from nor outrun. I hold the diary up to the light of a brighter dawn, and I hear the sea. But it's not the sea that speaks. It's the quiet certainty in a page I thought I understood. Thelma's handwriting, steady and almost cheerful in its cadence, includes one line I hadn't noticed before. A sentence about a vote that would never be counted because the person who kept the tally was no longer there to count it. The widow's vote wasn't counted. And so the village believed one thing about blame, while truth moved in another direction entirely. The diary closes with a final, cruel sentence. Lines about a pact that went wrong, a pact meant to shield someone who did not deserve protection. A pact that demanded silence from everyone who stood to gain if the truth came out. Then I see it, and the room tilts in me like a ship that has found a bottom in a sudden swell. The two deaths are not two accidents wearing the same face. They are two acts within a longer play in which the village has always been both audience and actor. The killer was never one man, not really. The killer was a patterned pactron by the village's oldest laws and the newest lies. A system that says we will name someone when things go wrong, but we will never name the truth that made the wrong possible in the first place. The 5-second moment is this realization pressed into my chest with the weight of the sea. The killer is not Eli Turner, the quiet widower. The killer is the village, and the vote was only ever a ritual that protected the desire to stay in the same story a little longer. I close the diary and breathe out a long, slow coast of air, the sea answering with a sigh that sounds like relief. The horizon is a thin line of pale gold, and the last birds circle with a patient, almost clinical calm. The killer remains out there somewhere, not in the hands of any single person, but in the hand the town always chose to believe was the right one until that night, when a diary and a tide told a different truth entirely.